past few videos, rather than looking at a birth date or a birth certificate, we've been finding people's ages by solving single variable equations. So today, let's do the exact same thing by looking at a few examples. Diane is 23 years older than her daughter, Amy. In 6 years, Diane will be twice as old as Amy. How old are they now? To better understand this question, let's put it on a timeline. Here's our timeline. Let's suppose this point at the start of our timeline represents the time now. So how old are Diane and Amy now? Well, since the question is asking to find their present ages or the ages of Amy and Diane now, let's assume how old they are. Let's assume that Amy is A years old. And since Diane is 23 years older than Amy, Diane's age can be assumed as A plus 23. Notice how I used parentheses here. Don't forget to use parentheses. It'll make it a lot easier to understand. Now, let's fast forward 6 years. As you can see, this point on the timeline represents a time 6 years later. So how old are Amy and Diane 6 years later? Well, to find their ages, all we have to do is add 6 to their current ages. Amy is A years old. So in 6 years, Amy's age will be A plus 6. But what about Diane? Diane is A plus 23 years old now. So in 6 years, her age will be A plus 23 plus 6, which we can simplify. 23 plus 6 is 29. That means Diane's age 6 years later will be A plus 29. So now we know Amy and Diane's age now and their age 6 years later. The question tells us that in 6 years, Diane will be twice as old as Amy. And we want to find the value of A. So we can solve the question and find how old Amy and Diane are now. So let's set this up as an equation. We can set it up like this. 2 times A plus 6, which is Amy's age in 6 years, is equal to A plus 29, which is Diane's age in 6 years. Next, let's open the parentheses. 2A plus 12 is equal to A plus 29. Now, let's bring the two variable terms to one side of the equation and take the constants to the other. So let's start by bringing positive a to this side of the equation. Next, let's take 12 to the other side of the equation. Now, let's simplify both sides of the equation. 2a minus a is a, and 29 minus 12 is 17. So, a is 17. This tells us that Amy is 17 years old now. But what about Diane? Well, we assumed Diane's age is a plus 23. And we know a is 17. So, to find Diane's age, we can do 17 plus 23, which is equal to 40. In other words, Diane is 40 years old now. Now let's look at a similar example. Pat is 20 years older than his son, James. In 2 years, Pat will be twice as old as James. How old are they now? Just like before, let's put this on a timeline. Here's our timeline. Let's represent this point as the time now. So how old are Pat and James now? Well, this is what the question's asking. So we don't know how old James and Pat are now. So let's assume their age. Let's assume James' age as a years old. And since Pat is 20 years older than James, that tells us that Pat's age is a plus 20. Now, let's fast forward 2 years. How old are James and Pat in 2 years? To find that age, all we have to do is add 2 years to James and Pat's present ages. So, since James is a years old now, in 2 years, his age will be a plus 2. And since Pat is a plus 20 years now, in 2 years, his age will be a plus 20 plus 2, which we can simplify. 20 plus 2 is 22. So, Pat's age in 2 years will be a plus 22 years old. Now, the problem tells us that in 2 years, Pat will be twice as old as James. So let's put this into an equation. We can set up our equation like this. 2 times a plus 2, which is James' age in 2 years, is equal to a plus 22, which is Pat's age in 2 years. Now, let's open the parentheses. 2a plus 4 is equal to a plus 22. Next, let's take the variable terms to one side of the equal sign and take the constants to the other side. As you can see, I brought positive a to the other side of the equation. And now, I took 4 to the right side of the equation. So now, let's simplify both sides of the equation. 2a minus a is a, which is equal to 22 minus 4, which is 18. This gives us the value of a, which is 18. So, since we assumed that James is a years old now, we know that James is 18 years old. But what about Pat? We assumed Pat's age to be a plus 20. And we know a is 18. So, to find Pat's age, all we have to do is add 18 plus 20, which gives us 38. So, Pat is 38 years old now.